I was recently checking out one of the new starter sites for Blocksy Pro and came across this design that I quite liked. It's a Bento grid, which is pretty cool to start off with, very on trend right now. But I just liked the look of it and I thought, how easy would this be to recreate for myself? And that's what we're going to do in this video. Now, before we go any further, I am going to be using Bricks Builder and I am going to be using Advanced Themer because that makes working with creating these Bento grids super easy. But what I'll also do, if you don't have Advanced Themer, is I'll put the settings in so you can see. Put those in the description and details down below so you can use those to get the same end result if you don't have Advanced Themer. Anyway, let's take a look at how we could create something very similar to this. So this is what I ended up creating. As you can see, it's pretty much the same as what we saw in that starter site. The only difference is I've put a drop shadow onto these little cards because I kind of think it separates them from the background a little better with the images that I've chosen. So, how do we create it? It's not as difficult as it may seem. Okay, I've created a new page and I've inserted a section with a container. Now our container is going to contain our overall Bento grid. We also want to set a background on this. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll select the container, we'll come over, we'll give this a name. We'll just call it Bento container. Okay, so now we've created that, we can start styling things. So make sure that Bento container is selected. Come to our background, we're going to choose one of our global colors. We'll choose this kind of dark bluey gray color, and that's the good starting point. So let's go into our border and box shadow section, open up our borders, and we're going to connect our radius, and we're just simply going to round these corners off. Now I'm using Core Framework, so that just speeds everything up, having all my sort of variables set up, but you don't need to. You can input the values that you want to use inside. You're using whatever you want to use, rems, ems, pixels, anything you want. So let's just choose from here. I'm going to come down into my border radius, and for this I'm going to set a large border radius. I want nice curves. Now a good little tip here is when you want to create card designs like this kind of thing we're doing here, and you've got multiple different curved items inside there, you want to scale them as they get further into the design. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If you look at the final example, you can see the overall card itself has the largest radius on the outside edges. Then if we go in and we take a look at the picture, you'll see that's using about 50% of the initial value. So if you said you start off with 24, you may have this set as something like 16 or 12. And then when you go down to the small card inside there, that's smaller again around 50%. If you have them all set to the exactly same radius, it looks weird. That's the only way I can kind of say it. It doesn't look right. So as you move into your design, take the radius on each of those different elements and make them smaller, around 50% smaller. Just makes sense. Okay, so that's our initial container all set up. Let's rename this and we'll call this Bento container so we know what we're dealing with. Always good housekeeping. Okay, so now that we've got the Bento container set up, we want to put the pieces we want to use inside. So what we're going to do is making sure that container is selected, we're going to come over and we're going to insert 5 different block elements. Now, the reason we use block as opposed to div is because the block will take up 100% of the container it sits inside. And I just find these are a little bit more flexible. So we're going to drop 5 blocks inside there. They're all going to be exactly the same. Now you can see that one of the problems we have here is everything is sitting flush against the edge. So we're going to come back to our Bento container, make sure we still have our class selected, come into our layout, and let's put some padding inside here. So let's lock our sides together because we want the same pattern, equidistant all the way around the edges. And again, we're going to set up one of my variables. So we're going to come back up to our spacing, and let's say we want to use something. I'm going to go for large. I want nice space around this. So we'll click, and there we go. Now that's given us our starting point. So the next thing we can do is to create the actual grid itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our Bento container one more time if it's not selected. We're going to come over into our content, and from there we're going to change our display from flex into grid. And now nothing at all happens, which you'd expect because we've only basically just told it we want to change it to a grid. Now we can start to use the visual grid builder that's part of Advanced Themer. And what makes creating these designs just so quick and easy. We'll open it up by clicking the grid builder option, and this by default gives us a 4x2 kind of row column layout, which is not what we want. Let's go and take a look at our actual design. So looking at our finished design, I can see from here how things are going to lay out. We're going to kind of look at these in rows and columns like a spreadsheet. So if we take a look at the right-hand column, you can see that we've got this top image and these bottom two images are taking up about 50% of the vertical space. Then take a look at the bottom two, they're taking up about 50% of the horizontal space. So just by looking at that side, we can see we would need to have 2 columns and 2 rows. But the problem we've got then is if we take a look at the left-hand side, we've got this main picture taking up about 75% and this top text taking up about 25%. So looking at what we have there, the easiest way to set this up would be a 4x4 grid. Switching back into Advanced Themer, let's change those values over. And now we can see we've got a grid we can start to work with. So all we need to do is position these different pieces where we want them. So let's just start positioning them. We'll pop that one there. Now, unless you've got specific content, it's not really worth worrying too much about the actual order of these unless you put the content in, which is why I'm kind of doing the grid side of things before I put the content in. Okay, so now we're going to just grab this third one, drop that into there. We're going to grab this one and pop that there for now, expand this one out and expand this one out as well. So you can see we've now visually recreated the final design. We've got some options over on the right hand side we're going to set up. So we're going to say we want to use the use min max, and for this example we'll say replace CSS automatically. This is really useful when you're working in various different ways with Advanced Themer. For example, if you're using a loop and you use this to create and design the loop, you can have this that every time you make a change inside here and you save it, it won't just sort of add in extra CSS, it'll replace what's already there. It's just a little useful tip. Okay, so there's the starting point design. Now all we need to do is effectively go over to the different responsive modes and adjust this accordingly. So we may say that when we go over to tablet portrait, we're happy with this design. But when we go over to mobile landscape, we want this to kind of collapse down to just a single column and multiple rows. So we stack everything on top of each other, which will look better on that kind of design. Then just select the option you want for the responsive mode from these icons and then just adjust what you have here. So for ease, I'm simply going to put all these back into one column. I'm not going to worry at this point the stacking order because I just want to quickly demonstrate how easy it is to set things up here. Then you can worry about stacking order afterwards. You can see everything is labeled anyway. Let's set our rows to 5 so we can open up that extra row. Close that down a little bit and position that there. So they're in the right order, I think, anyway. And now what we can do is we can just change the columns over to 1. And we've now set up how this is going to adjust responsively based upon our settings. We'll apply the grid and close. And you can see when we switch this view, we can see it's stacking. We go over to mobile portrait. You can see that now shows us the way it's supposed to be. And if we click over onto desktop, you can see it's scaled the way that we want there as well. So we've now set up the responsive way of this working. So now what we can do is we can start building out the content. So let's start off with the very first block, which is effectively just going to include some text. So what we're going to do is we'll select it and we'll just pop in a heading and we'll pop in some basic text there as well. Choose our heading and just quickly apply some simple styling to this. Now, we can style this on the ID level, or if you wanted to, you could apply classes to it. It's up to you how you want to work. For this example, I'm going to style some of these on the ID level, and when it makes sense, we'll take a look at creating some global classes for them. So with the heading, for example, we'll set this to be H3 as perfectly fine from a semantic point of view. We'll put the text we want in, and we'll just come in and just apply some basic styling. So typography, we'll set the color on here, so we'll set this to be white. Set our sizing, we'll say we want text to be large, and we'll say we want the font weight to be 600. There we go. And we're just going to do the same thing here. We'll just come in, we'll set our color. And we'll also come in and set our text size, and we'll set this to be medium. And while we're at it, we'll select our block, and we'll come down into the option for our row gap, and we'll just set a variable inside here as well. And we'll set this to be something like small. There we go. So we've now set up the basics there. So next up, we've got these different blocks now that have the images to be placed inside them. So let's do just that. Let's select our first block, and we're going to come over to our style, to our background, select our image. We'll pop our image inside there. You can see, there's our first one. Do the same thing now for our next block. Select our next image. Same again. And our final one. Okay, so there's our basic blocks put in there. Now, obviously, we want to do things like round the corners off, like we've said. So what makes sense now is to create a class that we can apply to all of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the name of these over to image block. And we rename this first one just a text block. Again, like I say, just for good housekeeping. So we'll select our first image block, and what we're going to do is we're going to apply a class to this. So we're going to create a new class. I'm going to use BEM naming. Now, this is just a nice way of being able to organize things. And if you hand this off to someone else, they can see a little bit easier what's going on. So the image block sits inside the Bento container. So do bento-container, which is the class we created earlier on. Use 2 underscores, and we're going to call this image. And now what we're going to do, hit enter, and we've now applied it to that image block. So now what we can do is we can come into things like our border, come into our border one more time, come into our radius, link those together. Now we use the radius of large on the outside. So this one's going to be radius medium. There we go. We'll select that from there. Job done. Now you see none of the other ones are being affected. So we'll come on to that in a moment. So what I also want to do is just make sure we've got this selected and apply a little bit of padding inside here. Because if you remember, we've got to put those little cards inside. They don't want to sit flush against the edge. So we may as well make our lives easier at this point. So we'll again choose our padding. We link all those sides, use one of our variables. We're going to come over to our spacing and we'll say, we'll go for medium to start off with. We may need to come back in and change that afterwards. So choose medium. Now, obviously, nothing's going to show up because we haven't inserted those little cards. Okay, so we've set everything up there. Now, what we need to do is choose our next image block and just assign the same class. So we'll do our Bento container image. That now picks up everything we've just done. So we'll do the same thing again. So come over, Bento, and finally the last one. So now, if we want to make any changes to any of those, we can easily do it. So let's say we didn't like the actual border. We'd made a mistake. We don't want to get rid of it. Well, let's come in and we'll just select those and we'll just delete everything. And now all of those examples of that image have been updated accordingly. So we can make sweeping changes to our overall design because we've applied that class. And by using BEM naming, we know that the Bento container is the parent, and inside there, the image blocks are inside that Bento container. And that's why we're using that underscore image. Hope, again, that makes sense. Okay, so let's put that back to what it was. Okay, so we're making strides. Now, one thing I've noticed is that the gap in between each of my different sections is not right. So what we're going to do is going to come back to our Bento container, go to our content, and you can see by default we've got a 20 pixel gap. Well, we don't want that. Let's use what we want, which is our own specific spacing. So now what we can do is we can come in here and we can set the spacing that we want to use. So I think we use spacing large on the outside edge, and then we go, let's use spacing large now. So we've got consistency throughout everything. Let's hit save just to make sure everything is okay. Let's take a quick preview of this. And there you go. You can see things are looking pretty good. So the final thing we need to do is just add in those little cards. Let's open up our image block. And you can see nothing's inside there, but so we're going to add a div. And inside that div, we're simply going to add in a heading, and we're going to add in some basic text. Oh, you can see that's now positioned everything, and you can see now where the padding we inserted into the image container is all set up and working the way we want. Let's change the name of this. Call this card div, doesn't really matter too much. And now we can start designing this. So what we're going to do, first of all, is set a background color so we can see exactly what's going on and what we're kind of affecting. So with our card div, we'll come over to our styles. Now, it makes sense. We're going to have multiple ones of these. So again, it makes sense that we create a global class to apply to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back over. With a div selected, we're going to just type in the Bento container. So bento-container __ card. Hit enter. We've now created that class. So now we're designing this and applying this on a class-based level, not an ID level. And if you're not sure what I mean is, we've got a class selected and everything we do is going to apply it to the class itself. Whereas the ID level means there's no class created and you're applying it to the specific instance of that element. Again, hope that makes sense. Okay, so the card, let's select it, come into our background. Going to change our background color. We'll set that to be basically white. We're also going to come into our layout and we're going to add in some padding all the way around this. So let's again use one of our variables. We'll come in and we'll say something like small probably looks okay. So we're going to shrink these things down. Heading 3 is probably not the best option here semantically because it's going to be a little bit lower down the stacking order. So we'll set this to be H4. We'll change this over and give this a name. I'm not going to worry too much about duplicating this on everyone. We'll change the text underneath the basic text, and we'll say this is going to be 24 products. There we go. So we can kind of see the kind of card we're working with. So let's go back to our card, making sure we've got our class selected, come into our styles, again, come into our border, open up our borders, link them together. This time we want to go one smaller again. So we're going to come up, we're going to do radius small, and now you can see they stack nicely together. And obviously the position is in the wrong place. So what we're going to do is select our image block, and from there, making sure we've got the class selected so it affects everything. Come into our content, and we're going to position this where we want it to be, which is going to be down the bottom. And there we go. That's set that up there for us. Job done. So now we can just quickly tweak text size and so on. So let's come into our typography. Let's come into our size. We're going to set this to be something like small. We'll make it a little bit heavier. So we'll say something like 600. And then for our product details, we're going to do the same thing again. We'll set that to be text small. We won't worry about changing the actually just make it a bit smaller again. There we go. Okay, so we've created what we want there. Let's simply select that and duplicate it a couple of times. And now what we could do is we could pop those where they need to go. So we'll just grab these cards. We'll pop that there, and pop that there. So now you can see it's inserted in all of them. So let's come into kitchens and change that over to living rooms, for example, and bathrooms, and bedrooms. Now you'll notice that living rooms is slightly longer word-wise, so we can see that this box looks a little bit longer compared to these. So let's standardize things. Come back to any of our card divs because we're using a global class. And what we can do now is we can come into our layout and we can specify a minimum width. So let's say, for example, 150. You can see that looks okay, but probably a bit too big. Let's say 125. That looks better. So now they're all completely and utterly consistent. And the same thing goes, you could set your minimum height if you wanted to and adjust things there to make sure everything looks the way that you want. And then finally, let's say we want to put a little bit of a drop shadow on it. So let's select the card, make sure it's selected one more time. This time we're going to go into our border box shadow. And we're going to take advantage of another feature that we've got in Advanced Thema, which is the box shadow generator. Come into our presets. Let's find one we think looks pretty nifty. We want a nice shadow, but nothing too massive. This one looks good. We'll say quick apply, and that's been applied to every single one of them for us. So now let's save this. Let's check it out. Everything's looking good apart from, you can see when we switch over to the smaller views, our images all start to fall apart. They get a little bit too sort of squishy. So let's deal with that next. Making sure that we've got the lowest option there. There we go. So what we can do is now come back to our image block and we can set a minimum height. So come into our layout, again, making sure that we have our global class selected. We can come into our minimum height and set this to a value we think looks good. There we go. We switch over into mobile portrait. There we go. They're looking all pretty good. Again, we'll save that, switch back over. So there we go. We've now seen how to create this kind of bento grid using Advanced Thema and the ease in which we can create these more complex layouts. Now we've learned a lot of different skills inside this particular video. We've seen how easy it is to create bento designs using Advanced Thema's Visual CSS Grid Builder. We've also seen how easy it is to be able to set up mobile responsiveness, start working with BEM naming, understand how global classes work, and how easy it is to make sweeping changes in a matter of seconds, not minutes, using global classes in Bricks Builder. Now, if you'd like to learn more about how to create designs like this, let me know in the comment section down below what kind of designs you'd like me to check out, and I'll see about creating more tutorials on this kind of topic. As always, my name is Paul C. This is WPTuts, and until next time, take care.